She had heard thousands of hymns in her lifetime, but this one, this haunting melody drifting through the stone corridors, felt like something her soul remembered before her mind did. A hymn that seemed to rise not from human voices, but from somewhere older, deeper, as if the walls of the church themselves were singing. And yet, when the final note faded, every choir member blinked in confusion. Not one of them recognized the melody. Not one remembered singing it. Not one could describe a single lyric. When she rushed to the choir loft looking for the sheet music, the stand was empty, completely bare. No pages, no scribbles, no remnants of ink. But the air still trembled, as if the hymn was echoing from a place beyond memory. Hours later, long after midnight, the janitor found something lying exactly where no one had placed it. A sheet of music, aged, yellowed, written in a language no one had seen before. Notes that didn't follow human structure. Symbols that looked more like prayers than musical notation. And at the bottom, a date that shouldn't exist. A date from 50 years in the future, with her own name signed beneath it. She stared at the ink, fresh, still drying, trying to understand how it was possible. How could she sign something she never touched? Why did the choir forget a hymn that shook her entire being? And why did she feel, deep in her chest, that this was not an accident, but divine timing, a message meant for her alone? A call toward redemption and prosperity of the soul she had been avoiding her entire life. The hymn came from somewhere. Someone wanted her to hear it, and now she would have to discover why. The night it happened, the church was supposed to be empty. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the wooden pews. She entered only to pray. A quiet moment, she thought, a moment to breathe after a week that had felt heavier than most. Life, money, faith, purpose, everything felt misaligned. She had been drifting far from God, far from herself, and far from the prosperity of spirit she once carried so naturally. But the moment she stepped inside, a tremor moved through the air, subtle yet strangely familiar. She paused. Listened. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the archway, a choir began to sing. Not a warm rehearsal, not a common hymn. This sound felt ancient, vibrating like a memory buried beneath years of silence. Voices layered with impossible precision, rising with a purity she hadn't heard since childhood. A harmony that pulled her forward as if someone, or something, wanted her closer. She walked the aisle slowly, her breath sinking with the music, the scent of old cedar and candle wax wrapping around her like a veil. But as she reached the nave, the voices stopped, abruptly. The silence afterward hit harder than the hymn itself, an emptiness too deliberate to be natural. The choir stood motionless, confused, as though waking from a dream. No sheet music, no memory of singing, no explanation at all. Later that night, when the clock slipped past midnight and the church should have been swallowed in darkness, the janitor found a single sheet of music resting on the altar. A page that hadn't been there. A page no human hand placed. A page carrying her future signature. And in that moment, her life split into two timelines. The one she thought she was living, and the one she was meant to uncover. By the time Claire pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the city outside had already blurred into a smear of wet light and distant sirens. Rain clung to her coat, cold at the collar, and the first breath of the sanctuary's air felt strangely thick, like stepping into a memory that hadn't decided to reveal itself yet. The overhead lamps were dim, leaving most of the pews in shadow, and the stained glass windows caught the occasional flick of lightning like muted, frozen fire. She told herself she had only come to sit, to rest, to say a prayer she no longer believed would be heard. but something in the silence felt too intentional, too aware of her presence, as if the room had been waiting. Her heels clicked softly against the tile as she walked down the center aisle, each step echoing more loudly than it should have in a place supposedly empty. She could smell beeswax and old incense buried in the grain of the wood, hear the faint buzz of electricity in the overhead fixtures. She glanced toward the choir loft, expecting darkness. Instead, a faint glow pulsed there, like breath. Then she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind, low, rising, carrying a tone, but within seconds the sound shaped itself into voices, not one, not two, but an entire choir, seamless and layered, rising from a place beyond the visible. She froze halfway down the aisle. The hymn didn't begin with a clear note. It seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, as though the stone had been holding it for centuries. The melody felt both unfamiliar and deeply intimate, threading through the air like a memory she had tried to forget. It bypassed her logic and went straight to that part of her chest where fear and longing had been wrestling for years. The harmonies rose and folded over one another in impossible perfection. No missed entrances, no breaths out of place, no human hesitation. Claire's first rational thought was that a late rehearsal had been scheduled without notice. Her second thought was that choirs this precise did not rehearse in near darkness without a conductor waving arms in front of them. She moved closer to the front, trying to spot movement in the loft. Shadows shifted, but she couldn't distinguish individual faces. The hymn grew, thickening the air, and as it moved, something else moved inside her. A strange, sharp ache, like the kind she felt when she remembered who she used to be before life became a cycle of bills, deadlines, and quiet spiritual exhaustion. She had heard stories, testimonies all her life, millionaire businessmen who claimed that one moment of faith turned their lives around. Women who spoke about manifestation and divine timing, about how the right prayer at the right hour opened doors to prosperity and abundance. She had nodded, even clapped, but a part of her always stepped back inside, arms crossed, whispering, "Not for people like you, not after what you've done, not after what you've failed to do." Tonight, though, the hymn didn't sound like a promise for people like her or for better believers. It sounded like it was searching for her specifically. She reached the front pew and slowly sank down, never taking her eyes off the loft. The notes dipped and rose in patterns that didn't belong to any hymn she had heard in decades of Sunday mornings. There were no clear verses or choruses, just a continuous journey, like a river that refused to break into parts. Words formed on the edges of sound, but whenever she tried to grasp a lyric, it dissolved into pure tone, slipping past language and landing directly in emotion. A chill feathered up her arms, and she rubbed her hands together, unsure if it was the cold or something else. She thought of the life she had built, the careful, responsible one, the career that paid enough to survive but never quite enough to breathe. The apartment where silence rang louder than any music, the nights she fell asleep scrolling through other people's lives, telling herself she'd missed her chance at redemption. In the dim light, listening to that unreachable hymn, she felt an uncomfortable thought snake to the surface. What if the reason nothing changes is because you don't believe anything still can? The final chord came without warning. One moment the sound was rising, almost unbearable in its beauty. The next it was gone, sliced cleanly from the air. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt dense, crowded, like a room where someone had just spoken a truth and everyone was holding their breath. Claire stood, heart thudding, and turned slowly toward the loft. She expected to hear chatter, see heads turning, pages rustling. Instead, the choir stood eerily still, hands at their sides, faces blank as if waking from a sleep they hadn't meant to fall into. The choir director lifted his hands, not to cue another song, but in a helpless gesture. "What just happened?" he asked quietly, voice echoing. Some of the singers glanced at one another, confusion tightening their brows. A soprano shook her head. "What piece was that?" she asked. No one answered. A young tenor frowned. "We didn't rehearse that," he murmured. "Did we?" Another alto laughed nervously, as if waiting for someone to admit this was a joke. No one did. Their music stands were empty. No folders, no books, no scribbled notes. Just bare metal and the faint imprint of where paper should have been. Claire stepped into the side aisle, pulse racing. They didn't recognize it. They didn't remember. She wanted to speak, to say, "You just sang something impossible." But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she watched them file out slowly, murmuring among themselves about schedules, about the rain, about anything but the hymn that had just rearranged the air and then erased itself from their minds. One by one, the voices and footsteps faded, until the church was left with only the sound of the rain returning to dominance. For a long moment, she stood alone under the arches, staring up at the now dark loft. Something inside her wanted to run, to dismiss it, to file this under strange things that happen in old buildings. Another part of her, the quieter, older voice she hadn't listened to in years, whispered, "Stay, watch, listen again." She checked the time on her phone. Late. She had emails waiting, dishes in the sink, a full schedule tomorrow, but none of that felt as urgent as the unfamiliar pressure in her chest, like a door being knocked on from the inside. Before we go deeper, if you're listening to this right now, take a quiet second to breathe. If these kinds of stories touch something in you, consider subscribing to this channel and turning on the notifications. And if you feel comfortable, type in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone on this journey already changes how the story lands in our hearts. When Claire finally left, the sanctuary lights had dimmed even more, leaving long shadows stretching like spilled ink across the floor. The custodian nodded at her as she passed. Mr. Alvarez, an older man whose presence had become part of the church's architecture. "Late night," he said softly. She managed a smile. "I lost track of time." He tilted his head slightly, as if he could see the whirlwind behind her eyes, but he didn't press. "I'll lock up after," he said. "You get home safe." She stepped back into the rain, the cold drops hitting her face with a clarity that felt almost aggressive after the thickness of the sanctuary air. The hymn lingered in her mind, but not as sound, more as an imprint, like the afterimage of a bright light burned into vision. She tried to hum it, to trace the melody, but as soon as she opened her mouth, her mind emptied. The notes scattered, as if whatever she'd heard refused to be repeated. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the choir loft glowing faintly, the invisible voices weaving through the arches, her own name somehow tangled in the unresolved tension of the final chord. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on rest and sat at her small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. Her bank app, still open on her phone from earlier, glowed with unapologetic numbers that didn't lie. Balances, due dates, reminders. Evidence of a life running but not arriving anywhere. What unsettled her most wasn't just the hymn. It was the feeling that it hadn't been meant for the choir at all. It was meant for her. An invitation, a warning, or both. Back at the church, long after her footsteps had faded from the street, Mr. Alvarez moved slowly through the sanctuary with his usual ritual. Check the side doors. Extinguish any remaining candles. Straighten the hymnals. He hummed under his breath out of habit, some old tune from his childhood that never quite found all its notes. As he approached the front, something caught his eye on the altar. At first, he thought it was a forgotten leaflet or bulletin. But the closer he came, the more wrong it felt. A single sheet of music lay there, perfectly centered, edges aligned with the edge of the cloth. The paper looked old, not dusty, but aged, like something pulled from a box that had been waiting a long time. Symbols and notes danced across the lines, but not in any structure he recognized. They curved and intertwined, more like a written prayer than readable music. His breath hitched. "Father?" he whispered to no one, his voice swallowed by the vast ceiling. He hadn't placed it there. No one had approached the altar after Claire left. Or had they? He reached for the page, and as his fingers brushed the corner, he saw it. A name, handwritten at the bottom in fresh, dark ink, letters still sharp and glossy before fully drying. Claire, followed by a date that didn't make sense, a year that hadn't arrived yet. He stared, the tiny hairs on his arms rising, the silence around him suddenly too loud. Someone or something had left a message, and whether he liked it or not, he was now part of it. The next morning arrived with a muted grey sky that seemed to press itself against the city. Claire hadn't slept more than an hour, but exhaustion felt secondary, almost irrelevant, compared to the weight sitting in her chest. She moved through her apartment in slow, careful motions, as if the air were heavier today, or as if something unseen was watching the way she carried herself. Every sound seemed sharper. The whistle of the kettle, the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator. Yet beneath all of it, she felt the same echo from the night before, not a sound now, but a feeling, like the hymn still lived somewhere behind her ribs. She reached for her coat, hesitated, then let her hand fall. Work could wait for a few minutes. Emails could wait. The endless cycle of responsibilities could wait. Something was pulling her back toward the sanctuary, the same way the hymn had pulled her forward. Not curiosity, something deeper than that, something like destiny, the kind people talk about in quiet voices, but rarely believe in. Divine timing, some would call it. She wasn't sure she believed in that anymore, but she also wasn't sure she didn't. At 8:14 a.m., her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mr. Alvarez. "Claire, I found something at the church last night. You should come." She stared at the screen, heartbeat stumbling. He wasn't the type to send vague sentences. He wasn't the type to be dramatic. And he certainly wasn't the type to ask her to return so soon, unless something was genuinely wrong. She grabbed her keys. The church sat in its usual quiet posture at the end of the block, but as Claire approached, she noticed something unusual. The front doors, those heavy old wooden doors, were already slightly open, as if someone had pushed them in a hurry. The faint smell of rain drifted inside, mixing with the familiar scent of wax and polished wood. She stepped through, letting the door shut behind her with a low, resonant thud. The sanctuary was dim, though streaks of pale morning light slid through the stained glass, painting fractured patterns across the pews. She scanned the room, expecting to see the custodian somewhere near the altar or moving between aisles. Instead, she heard shuffling near the choir loft. "Up here," his voice called, soft, strained. Claire climbed the narrow staircase toward the loft, gripping the worn wooden railing. Dust motes drifted in the slanted light like falling embers. When she reached the top, she found Mr. Alvarez standing beside the music stand, his hands clasped together in front of him. He looked nervous. Not tired, not irritated, nervous. "Are you all right?" she asked. He nodded once, but didn't relax. Then he stepped aside. A single sheet of music lay on the stand. Her breath caught. It wasn't there last night. She had looked. Everyone had. The paper was the same one he had found, aged, yellow around the edges, almost fragile. Yet the ink on the page looked impossibly fresh, as though someone had written it moments ago. The notes curved in unfamiliar patterns, spiraling across the staff lines like something alive. The symbols were not quite letters, not quite musical notation. They felt more like prayers, cryptic, ancient, whispered into ink rather than written. At the bottom was her name, Her name written in her own handwriting, beneath it a date 50 years ahead. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as though someone had placed a hand there, not to choke her, but to hold her still, long enough to understand what she was seeing. "You didn't sign this," he said quietly. "No," she whispered. "Then how?" She shook her head, unable to form an answer, because no answer made sense, no explanation fit into the world she knew. Not memory loss, not a prank, not misplacement. This wasn't a forgotten note from her past. This wasn't something she had scribbled in childhood and somehow left behind in the church. The ink was too fresh, the page too deliberate, the symbols too unfamiliar. Something about the sheet seemed to pulse, almost imperceptibly, as if the melody inside it was stirring. She felt a shiver run along her spine. "This music," she murmured. "What is it? Who wrote it?" Alvarez lowered his voice. "Maybe the better question is, who was meant to read it?" She swallowed hard. "Why would it be me?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "Sometimes God answers in ways that confuse us before they guide us." She looked down again. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from movement, but from something else. Something inside her was reacting to it, almost recognizing it. A strange pressure rose behind her eyes, like the beginning of a memory she didn't know she owned. "What if this is a warning?" she whispered. "Or," he said softly, "what if it's an invitation?" She stepped backward, heart pounding. The loft felt smaller now, the air heavier. She didn't know if the pressure in her chest was fear or something dangerously close to hope. "Claire," he said, his voice almost fatherly, "you heard the hymn, you felt it. They didn't. There's a reason." "But I don't want to be part of something like this," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can barely hold my life together. I'm not someone God sends messages to." Alvarez sighed gently, not disappointed, sad. Maybe that's exactly why he does. The words lingered between them, weighty and unsettling. Her eyes drifted to the blank space below the future date. Space left intentionally empty. Space waiting for something or someone. A signature, a response, a decision. Her pulse quickened. "What do I do?" she asked, shaken. He shook his head. "I don't know, but I think the hymn isn't finished." She felt a cold rush in her veins. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the page. "These symbols, these curves, they don't end. They're not a completed piece. It's like it's waiting to be sung again." She stared, and realization pricked at her skin. The hymn wasn't finished, the message wasn't finished, the story wasn't finished. And whatever was coming next, whether warning, calling, or something darker, wanted her present when it arrived. "Claire," he said softly, "tonight, don't be alone." Odin! Something inside her twisted sharply at that. A micro cliffhanger of intuition, a premonition, a tug from the same place the hymn had touched. Because deep down, beneath the confusion, beneath the disbelief, beneath the fear, she felt it. Something was coming. Something that wanted her name written on that page for a reason she had not yet learned. But soon would. Claire walked home with the sheet of music sealed inside an envelope she didn't trust her hands to hold bare. Every step felt too loud against the pavement, as though the world had grown quieter to listen to her thoughts. Cars passed, people hurried to work, children laughed near a bus stop. Yet she felt strangely detached from all of it. She moved as if inside a different frequency, carrying something invisible that pulsed between her ribs. The envelope warmed slightly in her coat pocket, impossibly warm for a piece of paper that had been resting in a cold sanctuary only moments before. Her apartment felt foreign the moment she entered. The ticking of the clock seemed too sharp, the hum of the fridge too steady, the muted light through the curtains too pale. She set her keys down and leaned against the counter, letting the weight of the envelope settle against her hip. She hadn't planned on opening it again, not yet, but part of her knew she wouldn't be able to avoid what it contained. Not forever, not even for an hour. She made tea she didn't drink, paced the kitchen in slow circles, then finally pulled out a chair and sat. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. She slid the sheet out gently, careful not to crease it. The symbols looked almost different in daylight. More defined, more deliberate, as if the sun brought out details the sanctuary's dim lamps had concealed. Some lines curved like vines, others looped into shapes that resembled stars, or eyes, or drops of water. But the part that drew her breath tight was still the same. Her name, written in her own handwriting, dated 50 years in the future. She traced her fingers lightly over the ink, half expecting it to smudge. It didn't. The strokes were confident, fluid, nothing like her handwriting in recent years, which had grown tense and cramped with stress. This version looked like someone at peace, someone certain, someone she didn't recognize anymore. A sudden chill drifted across the room, though no window was open. The hair on her arms lifted. She glanced toward the living room doorway, half expecting someone to be standing there. But the space remained empty, just the low hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of the curtains. Her phone buzzed. A text, this time from a number she didn't have saved. "Do you still hear it?" Her heartbeat jolted. She read it twice, 3 times. No name, no context. Just 6 words that tightened her stomach. She typed back slowly, "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then returned. Finally, a single message arrived. "It isn't finished." She swallowed hard. Fear crept through her veins with cold precision. Was this a prank? An algorithmic glitch? A wrong number? But the phrasing, the timing, the exact knowledge of what she had been thinking. She stood abruptly, grabbed her coat, and left the apartment. She didn't know where she was going, only that staying inside those 4 walls felt dangerous in a way she couldn't explain. She walked toward the park near the river, a place she often went to clear her mind. Today, the air carried the faint smell of wet stone and earth, and the trees swayed as if whispering among themselves. She sat on a bench overlooking the water. The wind brushed past her, lifting strands of her hair. Everything felt too calm, too still. She looked at the envelope again, then at her phone. No new messages, no call, no name. Her mind replayed the director's face from the night before. The confusion, the shock, the way the choir couldn't recall a single note. She remembered how the final chord had vanished from the air like someone cutting a wire. She remembered how the silence afterward had pressed against her chest like a prophecy. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind them, something stirred. A note, faint. Impossible. She opened her eyes sharply. The sound stopped instantly, leaving only her breath shaking in the cold air. Had she imagined it? Was the memory so vivid it was bleeding into her senses? Or was the hymn, whatever it truly was, trying to return? She lifted the sheet again. The symbols seemed darker now, wetter, as if freshly written. A gust of wind swept across the bench, lifting the edge of the paper. She tightened her grip, pulse quickening. The air carried a strange vibration, nothing loud, nothing musical, just a low pressure, like the deep hum of a distant engine. Then it shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something she could not fully define. Not sound, not silence, something in between. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she did. "You're close." She stood so quickly the bench rattled. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She scanned the park, only a mother pushing a stroller, an older man walking his dog, a jogger tying her shoe. No one was watching her, no one was texting her, But someone knew what she was feeling. Someone knew where she was. Someone knew the hymn was lingering inside her. The phone buzzed again. "You felt it again, didn't you?" Her throat tightened. She typed, "Tell me who you are." No response. She tried calling the number. Straight to voicemail. Generic, automated, no name, no voice. A knot of anxiety twisted deeper inside her, but beneath it, lurking like something half-buried, was something else. Recognition, as if part of her already knew who was reaching out. Or rather, what was reaching out. She walked along the path, her footsteps uneven. The river moved steadily beside her, reflecting the grey sky. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She'd spent years ignoring the subtle nudges of intuition, smothering them with logic, deadlines, and the noise of survival. But now, intuition wasn't whispering. It was screaming. She reached a secluded bend in the path, where the trees grew denser and the river narrowed. She sat on the stone ledge, hugging her coat tighter. The paper rested against her lap. The silence thickened, as if waiting. "Why me?" she whispered aloud. The faintest shift of the air came in response. Not an answer, a presence. Her fingers trembled as she looked down at the sheet again, and then she saw it. A new symbol, one that hadn't been there before. It curved like a spiral, breaking open, not drawn in ink, but appearing as if the page itself had grown it. A fresh note, a fresh part of the hymn, a sign that the message was still being written. Her breath stuttered. The hymn wasn't finished, but now it was beginning to finish through her. She closed her eyes again, slowly this time. The note returned, clearer, closer, calling her towards something she didn't yet understand, something that felt like purpose, something that felt like faith, something that felt like a manifestation waiting not to be believed, but answered. And as her pulse steadied, she understood one thing with terrifying clarity. The hymn wasn't coming from the past. It wasn't coming from the church. It wasn't coming from the choir. It was coming from her future. And it was coming back to collect her. Claire walked back toward the city, with the envelope pressed against her chest, as if holding it closer might stabilize the weight inside her. The new symbol on the page burned into her mind like an after-image she couldn't blink away. She kept glancing over her shoulder, not because she felt followed by a person, but because she felt followed by something else, like a thought that wasn't hers, or a memory that hadn't happened yet. The sky had darkened again despite the early hour, clouds rolling in with a heaviness that made the streets look older than they were. The air smelled of wet pavement and distant smoke. She pulled her coat tighter and turned the corner toward her building, each step feeling both too light and too heavy. She climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, not trusting the closed space. Her hands trembled slightly when she unlocked her door. The apartment greeted her with its familiar scent, lavender cleaner, the faint trace of last night's tea, the worn cotton of her sofa cushions. But something felt out of place. Subtle, not wrong, just different. She closed the door behind her slowly and stood still, listening. The living room lamps sat exactly where she'd left them. Her books remained stacked in uneven towers on the coffee table. But the air was thicker, like the sanctuary, like the park, like the choir loft. It carried the same breath of something waiting. She set the envelope down on the table and backed away as though it might move on its own. Her phone lay on the counter with its screen dark. No new messages. Nothing further from the unknown number that somehow knew her thoughts. She felt a wave of unease roll through her, deep, primal, like stepping into a cold river. The kettle clicked in the silence, though she hadn't touched it. She turned sharply, staring at the kitchen counter. It sat still, empty. The kettle hadn't been on. The click had come from somewhere else. Something settling, something shifting, or something unseen moving just enough to make itself known. Her heart pulsed in her ears. She forced herself to breathe, to move, to sit on the edge of the couch. But still, every few seconds, the apartment's atmosphere seemed to expand, as though a presence paced in slow circles around her. She reached for the envelope again, compelled by something she couldn't name. When she slid the sheet onto the coffee table, the lines and symbols looked even sharper than before, as if drawing themselves deeper into the page. She stared at the newest marking, the one that hadn't been there an hour earlier. It spiraled outward, thin at the top, widening at the base like a door opening or a voice rising. As she traced the shape with her eyes, a faint whisper of sound brushed her ear. One note, soft, almost human, almost her own voice. She flinched and turned. The room was empty. The note lingered behind her ribs instead of in the air. She felt it expand slowly, unsettlingly, as though the music was trying to learn its way back into the world through her body. She pressed her palm against her sternum, breathing through the strange vibration. Then her phone buzzed, the same number. This time only 2 words appeared. "Don't resist." Her pulse spiked. She typed without thinking. "Who are you?" 3 dots. Then, "You already know." She stood abruptly, pushing away from the couch. Panic flared. Her mind spun with possibilities, none of them sane, all of them terrifyingly plausible in the world she seemed to be stepping into. She paced to the kitchen and back, rubbing her arms, trying to shake the invisible hands pressing against her thoughts. Again her phone buzzed. "Look at the music." She froze. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned back to the table. A second new symbol had appeared. Her breath hitched sharply. It hadn't been there when she looked away. She hadn't blinked long enough for something so complex to form, yet the ink looked fresh, darker than the rest, glistening slightly under the muted lamp. She stepped closer. The new marking wasn't like the others. It wasn't curved or delicate. It was sharp, almost like an arrow or a warning or a command. She touched the page lightly with the back of her fingers. The paper was warm. Her phone buzzed again. "It's responding to you." A wave of dread swept through her. She typed quickly, "What do you want from me?" This time the answer came instantly. "To remember." She read the word over and over, trying to understand its weight. Remember what? A past she'd forgotten? A future she hadn't lived? The hymn she felt pulsing behind her eyes? She sank onto the floor beside the table, pulling her knees up, feeling small beneath the pressure of something she didn't have the language to name. Wind brushed her curtains. But the windows were closed, the lamp flickered, but the electricity hadn't dipped. Her phone vibrated again. "Tonight, the hymn returns." A slow chill spread through her chest. "Why me?" she typed. A long pause. Then, "Because you wrote it." She dropped the phone as if it had burned her. It clattered onto the floor. Her breath stuttered. She pressed a hand to her mouth. The room tilted slightly, as though the floor had shifted. She braced herself against the coffee table, squeezing her eyes shut. The message echoed in her mind, "Because you wrote it." She opened her eyes slowly and looked at the sheet again. Her name signed at the bottom. Her handwriting, the future date, the symbols shifting themselves, the melody she could almost hear, almost feel, almost recognize, like something she'd lived and forgotten. A tremor passed through her, deep and involuntary. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she gripped the table harder. She heard another faint note, clearer now, more insistent. She pressed a fist to her chest as the vibration grew. Then something terrifying happened. For a split second, so brief she questioned if it was real, she saw herself at the altar of the church, older, calmer, hands hovering over the sheet music, eyes closed, listening. She blinked hard. The image vanished. Only her apartment remained. She didn't know if it was a memory, a hallucination, or a glimpse of something else, something ahead of her, not behind. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't need to, because she already knew what the message would say. Midnight. The room went still. The air tightened. Her pulse quickened. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not be able to outrun whatever was coming. Not the hymn, not the message, not the future calling itself back to her. Midnight was coming, and the hymn would return. Not through the choir, not through the church, but through her. By late afternoon, Claire felt as though time had thickened around her. Every minute stretched, slowed, resisted movement. Shadows lengthened across her apartment walls long before the sun had fully set, curling like dark ribbons that seemed alive. She sat at her kitchen table with her elbows resting on the wood, fingers interlocked tightly, as though struggling to keep her thoughts contained. The sheet music lay in front of her, and she caught herself glancing at it every few seconds, afraid of what new symbol might appear if she blinked too long. The silence around her was almost oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing against her shoulders. She told herself she should leave the apartment, go somewhere crowded, loud, bright, somewhere normal. But the moment she considered stepping outside, something inside her tightened, as if the world beyond the walls had become distant, unreachable. It wasn't fear that anchored her, not exactly. It was anticipation, inexplicable and heavy. She felt pulled toward midnight as though a cord ran from her chest to the clock on the wall. The hands would move there eventually. They always did. But today, each tick felt personal, like a countdown she could feel beneath her skin. The room dimmed as the sun dipped behind the buildings, and she moved to turn on the lamp. The moment her fingers brushed the switch, the bulb flickered violently before stabilizing into a warm glow that filled the space with a strange golden hue. She exhaled slowly. Everything around her seemed to respond to her movements, to her breath, to her thoughts. She stepped back toward the table and sank into her chair again, hands trembling slightly as she traced the edge of the sheet with her eyes. Her phone vibrated against the table. She stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. The same unknown number. "Are you ready?" She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "Ready for what?" she typed. The answer appeared instantly. "For the return." Her stomach tightened. She typed again. "Why now? Why tonight?" This time the response took longer. When it appeared, she felt her breath catch. "Because this is the night you wrote it." Her hands shook. She set the phone down before she dropped it. She stared at the words as they blurred slightly. The night she wrote it. The thought pulsed in her mind like a heartbeat. She tried to swallow the rising panic, tried to ground herself with logic, but nothing held. The choir, the shifting cymbals, the melody in her chest, nothing belonged to logic anymore. A soft hum drifted through the apartment, low, continuous, barely audible. She stood instinctively, scanning the room. The refrigerator sat silent. The air conditioner remained off. The hum wasn't mechanical, it wasn't external, it was internal, inside her. She pressed a hand to her chest and felt a faint vibration beneath her ribs. Not painful, not alarming, but deeply unnatural. The kind of sensation that suggested something inside her was waking up, something that had waited, something she had forgotten. She tried humming back, just a gentle note to see if the pulse responded. The moment her voice broke the air, the vibration inside her intensified, matching the pitch of her hum for a single startling moment. She gasped and stumbled backward. Her voice had triggered something, or perhaps her voice was part of it. The phone vibrated again. "Don't resist it." She shook her head, whispering to the empty room, "What is happening to me?" The answer came in the form of memory fragments. Not clear images, not visions, just flashes of familiarity, like déjà vu, but sharper. She saw herself at a desk lit by candlelight, writing symbols that looked hauntingly similar to the ones on the sheet. She saw her hand moving with confidence, the pen gliding across paper as though guided by something beyond her. She heard the faint echo of the hymn, as though she had sung it first, long before the choir ever heard it. She snapped back to the present, breath uneven. "No," she whispered, shaking her head again. "This can't be real." But the sheet music disagreed. Another symbol bloomed on the page, forming slowly, as though written by invisible hands. It stretched across the staff lines, delicate at first, then growing bolder, cleaner, as if the ink were being drawn from the air itself. Claire stepped back, the room tilting again. Her vision sharpened and blurred in alternating waves. Her phone buzzed. "It's a lining." She felt anger flare beneath the fear. She snatched her phone up, typing, "Stop talking in riddles. Tell me what this is." A pause. Then, "It's your memory." She swallowed a harsh breath. "Memory of what?" The reply chilled her deeper than any cold wind could. "Of the night you finished the hymn." She sank back into her chair, weak. "Finished?" she whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear it. "How could I finish something I don't remember starting?" But deep down, beneath the layers of her denial and confusion, a tiny spark of recognition flickered. The symbols felt familiar. The melody felt familiar. The sensation of writing it felt familiar, like a part of her that had lived in another time, another version of herself, had left something for her to rediscover. A sudden pressure filled the room again. The air grew heavier, denser, almost vibrating. She felt drawn to the window, compelled by something she didn't understand. She pushed aside the curtain and looked down at the street. The night had fully claimed the city, leaving only pockets of streetlight and the faint reflection of her own face in the glass. And then, faint at first, but unmistakable, she heard it. A single note rising from the distance. Not from a car, not from a radio, not from any human voice. It came from the church. Her breath lodged in her throat. She grabbed her coat, the envelope, and her phone and rushed out the door. The hallway lights flickered as she passed, matching the pounding of her footsteps. The elevator dinged, but she didn't stop. She took the stairs, descending with urgency she couldn't explain. When she burst out onto the street, the wind swept against her face, cold and insistent. But beneath the wind, the hymn. It was returning. She began to run. Her footsteps echoed off the buildings as she raced down the sidewalk, the city's hum blending with the rising melody. The closer she got to the church, the more defined the hymn became, still not fully recognizable, but clearer than before. Each note vibrated in her bones, the way sound travels through water. Her heart matched the rhythm, as if syncing itself with something ancient and intimate. When she reached the church steps, she stopped, breathless. The front doors stood slightly open again, just as they had that morning. A pale golden light spilled out from within, flickering like candle flame despite no candles being lit inside. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She didn't need to look. She knew the message. She felt it before she saw it. Midnight. She pushed the doors open. The cathedral was glowing, and the hymn, unfinished, rising, waited inside for her. The moment Claire crossed the threshold, the doors behind her closed, with a slow, deliberate thud, as if the building itself had inhaled. The sanctuary glowed with a light that didn't belong to any bulb she'd ever seen. A gold too soft to be artificial, yet too steady to be candle flame. It pulsed gently, illuminating the pews, the arches, the altar. The air trembled with the beginning of the hymn, the first strands of a melody that felt like the echo of her own breath. Her footsteps softened against the aisle carpet as she walked forward, each step drawn by something deeper than curiosity, deeper than fear. The choir loft remained dark, empty, silent. The sound wasn't coming from there. It was blooming inside the sanctuary itself, as though the walls had become a chorus. The notes rose like warm mist, carrying a strange mixture of longing and inevitability. Her phone buzzed once more. She didn't look this time. She didn't need to. The message might as well have been carved into her ribs. Finish it. She approached the altar, the same place where the sheet had first appeared. A tremor ran through her as she pulled the envelope from her coat and removed the page. The new symbols, the shifting ink, her name, the impossible date, all glowed faintly, almost breathing. She laid the sheet on the altar cloth, and as she did, the light in the sanctuary brightened, as if acknowledging her arrival. She took a step back, waited, listened. The hymn rose again, fuller this time, layered and rich, the kind of sound that could only exist between worlds. Her pulse synced with it, her breathing falling into rhythm, as if she had known this song all her life. And maybe she had. Maybe this was the truth buried beneath everything she'd forgotten, buried beneath bills, routines, exhaustion, regret. A gust of air swept through the church, though no door had opened. The sheet fluttered, the ink pulsed. And suddenly, pain, sharp and bright, shot through her temples like someone striking a tuning fork inside her skull. She gripped the edge of the altar to steady herself. Images shattered across her vision. A candle-lit room, a younger version of herself, long hair, steady hands, sitting with the sheet music spread before her, symbols flowing from her pen like water, voices whispering guidance that felt like love, like faith, like divine timing. A vow spoken in a trembling voice. If I forget, let the hymn bring me back. Claire staggered, gasping. The hymn swelled violently, filling every inch of the cathedral, and she felt it, felt herself inside the music, felt something ancient and soft opening in her chest. Tears blurred her vision. She tasted metal. The notes trembled through her bones, not loud, but overwhelming. She remembered. She remembered writing it on a night just like this. Decades older, decades wiser, a future version of herself who had lived through a grief she didn't yet understand. A future where she had lost someone she loved so deeply that she had written a prayer disguised as a hymn, convinced that someday she would forget the meaning of her own life. And so she wrote it to herself, signed it, dated it 50 years ahead, left it to be delivered exactly when she needed it most. The future version of her whispered through time, "Come back to purpose, come back to faith, come back to yourself." Her knees buckled. She fell, catching herself on the altar steps. The hymn changed, turning brighter, fuller, letting hope bleed into the edges of sound. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, dissolving the years of spiritual heaviness she'd worn like armor. Her heartbeat steadied, no longer fighting the melody but joining it. She didn't try to hum this time. She simply opened her lips and breathed, and the hymn poured out of her, not sung, released. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was exact, each note aligning perfectly with the shifting melody in the air. The symbols on the page glowed, soft gold, turning white hot, illuminating the sanctuary. The voices in the walls harmonized with her, surrounding her in layers of sound that felt like memory and prophecy intertwined. With every line she released, the past and future folded inward, collapsing toward a single point. Now, the final symbol wrote itself on the page in a streak of bright light. The hymn reached its last note, a sound like the echo of creation. And then, silence. The light dimmed slowly. The air softened. The walls settled back into stone. Claire lay against the altar steps, breathing hard, tears streaking her cheeks. Not from fear, not from confusion, but from clarity. The sheet music no longer glowed. The symbols no longer shifted. The page was complete. Her name remained at the bottom, unchanged. But the date was gone. Erased, replaced by one word, handwritten in her future script. Remember. She touched it gently, A final note, soft as breath, floated inside her chest. Not a warning, not a prophecy, a promise. The front doors of the church opened with a quiet sigh, letting in a gust of cold night air. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, but her spirit painfully awake. She stepped out into the street, the city hushed beneath the glow of street lamps. Everything felt different, not safer, not simpler, just true. Her phone buzzed. For the first time, she looked without fear. The same number, one final message. You finished what you began. Now live what you remembered. She exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for years. The wind brushed her hair. The hymn settled inside her like a heartbeat she'd finally found, and the echo phrase that lingered through the night was hers alone. Some melodies are not meant to be heard. They're meant to be lived.